Eyeless is a really interesting book. It was published in 1936 after Brave New World, and in a way it kind of mirrors his early works, but perhaps goes a bit deeper. I think it was his most autobiographical novel, and the main character of Anthony, I think, is Huxley. More or less it's based on himself. When I started reading it, I wasn't sure because, I mean, the first few pages I was quite into it. I mean, I just love his voice, his writing style, and I'm fairly intrigued by anything he has to say for the most part, but the narrative is a little unusual. It kind of, at first it feels like he's just writing about random time periods and moving on, because each chapter is dated. Either it's just one day or it's a couple of days in a particular year, so say 1904, and the next chapter is a day in 1928. The novel goes between like early 1900s and to the mid 1930s. But after a while I realized that there is maybe a handful of specific dates, and though the chapters are always a different date, they always follow on from the last chapter that was in that time period, if that makes sense. So after a while you can kind of follow the sort of storylines that are separate within his lifetime, which I found really quite a fun way of reading, despite the kind of not so fun themes in the book. Anthony, the main character, is a really cynical guy. I found him kind of amusing. He's interesting, and he just wants to be free. He doesn't want to be like held down by anything. He doesn't want to be committed to anyone. He doesn't really believe in love. He doesn't really have much familial connections because of his own sort of childhood trauma and his loss, which again is very much, you know, mirrors Huxley's own life, which again adds another layer to experiencing this novel when you can consider his own life infused in the book. Anthony has a kind of a circle of people in his life that are recurring throughout his life. From I mean, most of the characters have been there in his life at least since his 20s, but particularly his best friend Brian, who he's known since he was a child. And Brian, I found him incredibly captivating. He was probably the most captivating character in the book, and I still think about him now because it's just very, I mean, his story just, I mean, I don't want to spoil it, but there's a lot there, and I kind of identified with it. I mean, I have to say most of the characters, with a few exceptions, most of them are people that you can identify with, which to me is one of the best things that you can get in a novel about people's lives. Anything to make you feel a little bit less alone in the human experience. I found that with that, each character also depicted a particular emotion or belief that we have, almost as if a spectrum of ideas have been split up into people. And in a way, this sort of reminds me of The Waves by Virginia Woolf, just in that sort of, you know, the interconnectedness of the characters, but also the inner workings of them, which keep them all so, you know, connected but divided. So in the way that Anthony is so, you know, as it says on the blurb here, in pursuit of liberty, his friend Brian is not at all. Brian is incredibly intelligent, just as intelligent as Anthony is. You know, they have the same education, he has the same lust for learning, and, you know, he's also, in the way that Anthony is, very steadfast in who he is and what he believes is right. But, you know, in contrast, Anthony, he really cares about what's right. You know, he wants to be good and he wants to do good things, and not in any kind of like, not for anything other than the fact that that's just what he believes. He's incredibly genuine in that way. I think it's rare to come across a character that is just good in a book, but of course, because this is, it's, it's a fairly realistic depiction of how things go as far as I'm concerned, and of course, even being as good as you possibly can ends up hurting people. It's hard to balance goodness and morality, and that's sort of, again, it's what being human is like. It's very complicated. So yeah, it's quite a tragic book, and it's very intellectual. For me, that was awesome. I really like that. I find I can enjoy a book, but if there's a deeper level to just events, but also like, analysis and philosophy and deconstructing political ideas, religious ideas and possibilities, spirituality, I can connect with a novel a lot more if it also has that going on. So for me, it's perfect, but it can make it a little unforgiving at times if that's not so much what you look for in a book. So keep that in mind if you want to read it. But again, I do think that's quite common for Huxley, so it's not that much of a surprise. The characters are all flawed, but they feel so real. I mean, by like a quarter or midway, I was so into like all of them. I wanted to know what they were going to do next, and I wanted to know more about their motives, about what's affected them to make them who they were. And there's this real sense of like, I mean, it's essentially a book of memories, and with that involves recollections of trauma and the way that people deal with it. Especially in that time, you kind of just go through something horrific and then you move on, which maybe is still what it's like nowadays, but definitely then it just seems everyone is just walking around with so much held inside that they don't know what to do with it, and they try and ignore it, but it always pops up again. It intrinsically makes these people who they are. And again, the mirroring of Anthony and Brian is so interesting to me because they both are missing a parent in some sort of way. Anthony has a father but no mother, and Brian has a mother and no father. And we shouldn't make assumptions about the way that this would affect a person, but of course it can. And I mean, it's up to the reader how much they think that affects these characters, but it's quite clear that really does mold these people and molds the different ways that they approach relationships. And I found that really just really interesting and really captivating and moving. I think just their friendship was one of the most beautiful parts of the novel. I mean, it almost made me cry in parts. The language is just beautiful, and the communication between them really strikes me. I mean, Brian also has a stutter, which is quite hard to read. No, not in the sense that you don't know what he's saying, but in the way that, like, to imagine this, and the way that he's so intelligent, but there are so many passages where it's really like accentuated that he doesn't know how to quite get across how he feels. And there's this one moment that struck me the most where he's with Anthony kind of near the beginning of the book, and Anthony suffered a loss, and they're only kids, and Anthony's already quite cynical. He's just like, oh, what are feelings for, we'll just be really cold and sarcastic about it, even though obviously he is hurt. And Brian is a lot more sensitive and emotionally attuned, and he's treated quite badly by his peers for his stutter and because he's good. Where there's this moment where he wants to kind of console Anthony in a more heartfelt way, and he can't get the words out, so he just like holds his hand, and it just, I don't know, the way that it's written is just so tender and beautiful. And I love the way that Huxley intersperses like these beautiful beautiful imagery and descriptions, which will then be like, you know, contrasted with some very lofty intellectual explorations. You know, I think it's just, that is kind of what it feels like to exist and experience things. We're always like feeling or thinking, you know. I mean, I think I could talk about this novel for hours, days. There's just so much in it. And I mean, I've only really touched on 2 characters, but all of the characters have so much going on. And the way that relationships are depicted between families and parents and children, little glances and movements. And Huxley really hones in on body language, which isn't always done that well in some books, but with him I really feel it. Like, I'm quite an observant person, so the way that he describes the way that a person sees, the way they move their head or the way they walk or something, really conveys a feeling, you know, that I would connect with that, and like it makes me really see these moments and understand these characters. It just left me with this really strong feeling to talk about it with someone, you know, to really discuss these people and their motives and deconstruct them. It's just fascinating. It's the kind of book that's sort of hard to follow up with in your reading, to pick something else after that. It just really, such a whirlwind for me. So obviously, I mean, it's probably one of my new favourites. I think that pretty much anyone would get something out of it if they're into introspective, slightly dense novels. I mean, it's not that dense, but I mean, it's quite wordy, so if you're into words, then it's probably pretty good. So yeah, thanks for watching my bit of a ramble about another great novel. So I hope you do get around to reading it if you like Huxley. And yeah, thanks.